So today I'm going to show you guys how to do a compression test and how to do a leak down test of your particular engine. Now, in the context of this video, guys, a compression and leak down test can give you really good insight overall as to the condition of the engine in your car or, whatever piece of equipment you're dealing with. And in the context of this video, I just bought this Chevy Cruze for about $1,000, right? Well, this thing is leaking oil and coolant from absolutely everywhere. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to determine, by doing a compression test and a leak down test, I'm trying to figure out the overall condition of this engine. And the reason that I'm doing that is if this engine has a compression problem or has a bunch of leak down out of the cylinder head, for example, well, there's really no point in me replacing a bunch of gaskets in this engine that's bad. So I'm really ultimately trying to determine here, is this engine any good or not? So like I said, these two tests can give you a bunch of insight as to the overall health of your engine. Now, just to get everybody on the same page as far as the compression and leak down tester go, the first thing you need to understand here is ultimately how a 4-stroke internal combustion engine works. And I'm going to break it down in the most simple terms that I possibly can. A 4-stroke gasoline engine is simply a piston and a cylinder going up and down. So you have a cylinder and a piston inside the cylinder that is going up and down. Now, the way this ultimately works is you have the piston going down the cylinder, drawing in air and fuel. The piston then goes up the cylinder, compressing the air and the fuel. The spark plug then ignites the air and the fuel, driving the piston back down from the explosion. The momentum from the explosion pushes the piston back up to drive the exhaust out of the cylinder. It then pulls the air and fuel back into the cylinder, starting the cycle over again. So what you're ultimately checking with a compression test is you're checking to see how much pressure can that engine ultimately achieve on that compression stroke. And generally speaking, the higher the compression figure is, the better shape the engine that you're dealing with is in. Now, naturally, there's going to be some variables in that compression number depending on the type of vehicle that you're dealing with, the type of engine you're dealing with, things like that. But as a general rule of thumb, the higher the compression figure is in the engine, generally speaking, the better the condition of the engine is overall. Now, to test the compression, what we're going to do is we're going to remove all of the spark plugs out of the engine, and then we're going to take a test adapter that's going to thread into the spark plug holes. Once you have the test adapter into one of the spark plug holes, you attach the gauge, and then you simply get in the car and try to start the vehicle. What that will do is that will cause the piston to go up and down that cylinder, and that gauge will then read the amount of pressure in that cylinder to ultimately tell you, again, what sort of condition the engine is ultimately in. Now, in the case of the leak down tester works on a similar principle, but it goes about the test a little bit differently. So a leak down tester, you simply take the test adapter, thread it into the spark plug hole just like you would with a compression tester, but the difference is you then use compressed air to fill the cylinder with compressed air, and the leak down tester will tell you how much of that air that's going into the cylinder, how much of it is actually leaking out through the piston rings, through the valves, things like that. So then you're able to figure out not only how much leakage the cylinder has, but we'll go over it a little bit later. You're also actually able to figure out where the compression in that cylinder is actually going. A compression tester will not tell you where you're losing compression. A leak down tester will tell you where the compression is ultimately going if you know where to look. So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of insight as to why these tests matter and why you might want to do one of these tests to your vehicle. All right, so over here at the bench, these are the compression and leak down test kits that I personally recommend. These are made by Lang Tools. And the reason that I recommend these kits specifically, guys, is Lang Tools is the provider, or the manufacturer, I should say, of Snap-on's compression testers and Snap-on's leak down testers. The difference is when you buy the kit from Lang Tools, you're getting the exact same thing, for roughly $250 cheaper. So these are the exact same thing as the Snap-on compression and leak down testers. I saw the Snap-on compression test kit was about 350 bucks. This one was about 140. The Snap-on leak down tester, I believe, was around $450. This kit was 100. So that is why, guys, I recommend these two kits specifically, because Lang Tools is in fact the manufacturer of Snap-on's compression and leak down testers. These are made in the USA. They are the exact same thing. The only difference is it says Lang rather than Snap-on on it. So these are the two kits, guys. With all that in mind, let's go over to the car and I'll show you kind of what you need to do each one of these tests to your vehicle. Now, the first thing you need to do if you're gonna do a compression test is, believe it or not, you should get the engine up to operating temperature. What that's gonna do is that's gonna get the piston, the cylinder, all the tolerances in the engine to what they normally are as the vehicle is being driven. So it's actually gonna give you a more accurate reading than what you would get, just doing it cold. Unfortunately, for my situation that I have here with this engine is, first of all, this engine has a big coolant leak. The radiator's leaking in it. So because of that, I can't run this engine to get it up to operating temperature because it has such a giant leak in the radiator. I don't want to overheat the engine. So because of that, I'm going to do this cold. Like I said, it's not exactly ideal, but even doing a cold compression test or a cold leak down test, that's still going to give you very good insight as to the overall condition of the engine. Now, probably the part that's the most involved throughout this whole process is simply removing the spark plugs from the vehicle that you're dealing with. Now, naturally, if you're dealing with a V8 engine, yeah, you need to remove all 8 spark plugs. Luckily for me, I'm dealing with a 4-cylinder that, the spark plugs are right here on top and everything's fairly easy to remove. If you leave the spark plugs in the vehicle for a compression test, it'll actually alter the cranking speed of the engine, which again will slightly skew your results. So for the best results, you really need to remove all the spark plugs out of the engine. All right, so once you have all the spark plugs removed from the engine, you can go ahead and take the test adapter that fits your particular engine and go ahead and thread it into the spark plug holes. It does not take a whole lot of torque when you're putting these adapters in here, like 2 fingers. That's all you need. You don't sit here and crank on one of these things, because what will end up happening is the rubber will separate from the crimped end down in the cylinder head, and you kind of got a mess on your hands at that point. So it does not take a whole lot of torque to get these to seal correctly. Then you'll take your gauge, quick connect the gauge just like you would with an air tool, and then just kind of lay that out of the way where you'll be able to read it once you're done cranking. All right, so a couple things worth noting before you just hop in the vehicle and just go ahead and crank it. First things first, make sure your battery's in good shape. If the battery isn't in good shape, it's gonna throw off the compression reading that you ultimately get, because a slower cranking speed is gonna change the amount of pressure that's gonna be generated in the cylinder. So if you look here, I've actually got a jump back hooked up to this battery just to ensure that I have as much battery energy as I possibly need to be able to do this test. Second thing is, when you get in the vehicle to crank it over, what you want to do is you want to get in it and put your foot flat to the floor on the throttle and then turn the key and try to start the vehicle. Now, obviously the vehicle's not going to start because you have all the spark plugs removed, but what that's going to do for you is really 2 things. First thing is, most vehicles that will put it into what is called a clear flood mode. A clear flood mode will not inject any fuel into any of the cylinders when you're cranking. So thereby it's going to make this process much safer, because then you're not spraying raw fuel out of the other 3 cylinders that you're not testing. If your vehicle does not have clear flood mode, you still need to go in and put your foot flat to the floor. It does tend to help the compression reading that you get on most vehicles. If your vehicle does not have clear flood mode, go ahead and pull the fuel pump relay or the fuel pump fuse. Whatever you need to do to be able to disable fuel on your vehicle. If you want to go through and unplug all 4 injectors in the case of this 4-cylinder car, yeah, you could go ahead and do that, but it's just a heck of a lot easier to go in the car and hold your foot to the floor. So with all that in mind, let's get started here. Now, if you guys listen to this car when it's cranking, as I'm doing the compression test, you will hear the change in engine tone every time cylinder number 1, in this case, comes up on compression. The engine will turn over very, very easily, and then when cylinder 1 hits compression, you'll hear the speed of the engine change. So foot to the floor, Turn the key on and gonna start to crank. So hopefully you guys can see that I was able to generate around about 200, 215 on that compression reading. So cylinder number 1, good to go. Then what you're gonna do is simply hit the button on the side. That'll release the pressure. You can unhook your gauge, set that off to the side, and then we'll repeat that for cylinder number 2 and just go right down the list. So now we'll do cylinder number 2 the exact same way. Thread this in, just snug it up, hook up our gauge, go in and start cranking again. So cylinder 2 is about the same. That's roughly about 210. So one thing to pay attention to as you're doing this compression test is just make sure that you're actually turning the engine over the same number of times for each test. What you'll find is at a certain point, the compression number will just stop going up. And at that point, there's no point in continuing to crank the engine. So really what I'm saying here is if you do a compression test of 3 compression strokes on one cylinder, don't do the next cylinder for 10 compression strokes and expect the number to be exactly the same. Just try to make sure you're doing relatively the same number of compression strokes on each cylinder. So GM specification for these engines, as far as compression is concerned, they tell you it's a range between 175 and about 210 PSI. And guys, every cylinder I have here seems to be perfectly fine. All these were well over 200 PSI. So by and large, right now, I can tell you with confidence that this engine is in good shape. Now, if you have a scenario where one of the cylinders that you're dealing with is low, well, now we're gonna get into the leak down tester, and the leak down tester, it will tell you exactly where the compression from that cylinder is ultimately going. Is it coming out the intake? Is it going out the exhaust? Or is it possibly, coming out the crankcase? The leak down tester will tell you that. All right, so moving on to the leak down tester, guys. Overall, I'm a much bigger fan of a leak down tester than what I am a compression tester, simply because they just give you a heck of a lot more information, more than just is the cylinder making pressure or not. The nice thing with one of these, yes, it will tell you if the cylinder is ultimately able to hold pressure, but like I was saying a second ago, we'll get into it, it'll actually tell you where the compression is leaking from, so you actually know what is actually wrong in the engine. Now, the only advantage that a compression tester has over a leak down tester, in my opinion, is going to be diagnosing issues related to valve timing. So when that piston's going up and down in the cylinder and you're cranking the engine over doing a compression test, you can sometimes pick up on valve timing issues from bank to bank with a compression tester that you can't pick up on that with a leak down tester, because a leak down tester is a static test. A compression tester is a dynamic test because you're cranking the engine over and actually using the engine itself to develop the compression. With this, you're just using compressed air and shooting it into the cylinder to verify how much of it is actually leaking. The only other thing worth noting about the compression tester versus the leak down tester is with a leak down tester, guys, it uses a slightly different adapter. Hopefully you guys can see that, but there's no Schrader valve in the end of a leak down test adapter. A compression tester has a check valve in the end of it here that is what holds the pressure on the gauge that you're ultimately having to relieve with that button. A leak down tester doesn't have that. So you can't use a test adapter for a compression tester with a leak down tester. What you can do is if you pull the Schrader valve out of the end of the compression test adapter, then you can use it with the leak down tester. But just keep that in the back of your mind, that make sure you're using the right test adapter if you have both tests on hand. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do here is just like the compression test, I'm gonna take the test adapter, thread it into the spark plug hole. You don't have to get this super tight, just snug it up. Then you're gonna take the leak down tester itself. It's gonna quick connect, just like the compression tester did. The difference is, then I'm gonna take compressed air and attach it to this end of the tool. So then I'm going to put some pressure in the cylinder. And you guys may or may not be able to see that. Let me move the camera here. So as you guys can see there, I'm putting roughly about 70 PSI into that cylinder. It's showing 100% leakage. Well, it's showing leakage because I'm on the wrong stroke. One of the valves in that cylinder is open, be it either intake or exhaust, I don't know which. So what I have to do now is I actually have to turn the engine over on the crankshaft with a breaker bar to get the engine on the right stroke so we get a proper reading here. So as I turn this over, let me see if I can get this on camera. As I spin this, so you kind of got to hold it in place. But you can see there, I'm putting just under 80 PSI into that cylinder. Now, before you actually read the leak down, you need to get this gauge to 100. So let me spin this over. And you really have to do this when the valves are shut, because if you try to make it read 100 with the valves open, once the valve's shut, it's gonna read much, much higher. So if you look there, let me see if I can get it to focus. That cylinder is showing 1 to 2% leak down. You can see the gauge here is set right about 100, and you can see the other gauge there on the opposite end. I'm running out of fingers and hands here because I'm holding the bar. I'm holding the bar down here with this hand in order to get this reading. So you can see right here, cylinder number 1, it's like 1–2% leak down. The cylinder overall is in excellent shape. So the next thing I need to do here is I need to go to the next cylinder. Now, your natural tendency is going to want to go to the next one in line. What you guys actually should do to make this go a little bit quicker is if you go in the firing order of the engine, the next cylinder that's going to come up on compression is going to actually, in this engine, is going to be number 3. So I'm going to go from 1 to 3 to 4 to 2. And that's the firing order of this engine. So that's the order that I'm going to conduct this leak down test in. To unhook the leak down tester, just thread your regulator back. That'll take the pressure off of this hand and this ratchet. So now I can let go, and now you're safe. The thing is, guys, if you leave that ratchet down on that crankshaft and you put pressure in that cylinder, it's going to try and move that breaker bar, that ratchet, or whatever you're using. Whenever you have the ratchet on the crankshaft, just make sure that you're either A, holding the bar, or B, there's no pressure on the gauge and on the bar itself, because if you leave this on here and throw pressure on this cylinder, it's going to take this bar and just move it. And whatever it's going to run into is what it's going to tear up. So you have to be mindful of that as you're doing this. So what I want to get into now is how to figure out where your leakage in the cylinder is actually coming from. Now, to do this, I have a very, very poor example because the leak down on this engine is about 1 to 2%. This engine has very, very little leak down. Generally, if your leak down number is under 15%, generally speaking, the engine's fine. If you're over 20–25%, well, you're going to notice some power loss in that cylinder, and at that point is when you want to start diagnosing perhaps where is it actually coming from. So to be able to do that, there's a few things you want to look at. First of all, the intake tube. If you pull the intake tube off somewhere, you could do it up by the throttle body or over by the air box or wherever it's convenient. If you listen to the intake tube when there is a high amount of leak down, you will actually hear air coming out of the intake tube if it's coming out of an intake valve. If it's coming out of an exhaust valve, you will hear air coming out of the tailpipe back at the back of the vehicle. If it is going into the crankcase, if you pull the oil fill cap off and you have air coming out of the oil fill cap, the air is getting past the piston and it is going into the crankcase in that cylinder. So that is largely how you determine where the combustion pressure is ultimately going. Now there's one other thing that you can check here, and believe it or not, you can actually check the integrity of a head gasket using a leak down tester the exact same way. So if I go over here to the coolant bottle and I pull the lid off the coolant bottle and there's pressure in here, well, the only place that that pressure could be coming from is this tester. You can hear there's no pressure here. So I know my head gasket on this cylinder is intact. I know my intake and exhaust valves are intact, and I know my piston is in good shape. So based on that leak down number and the fact that I'm not hearing any air escape out of any of these different areas, that is how I'm able to determine that this engine is in extraordinarily good shape for the condition of it. All right, so this scenario I'm showing you guys right here is like a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So let me take this back, get this back down to 100. And if you look there, I'm showing like 17% leak down. There's quite a bit of leak down on this cylinder, right? Listen to the intake on this car. You can see, feel, and hear the air coming out of the intake. So right now, I know based on this result right here in this particular spot, that this vehicle has 17% leak down out of the intake valve only. So this is why a leak down tester is just much more beneficial than a compression tester for most vehicles. So overall, as you guys saw, this engine is actually in excellent shape, and given the amount of coolant and oil leaks it has, honestly, I thought for sure going into this that I had figured, you know, this thing had been overheated at some point in its life, possibly been damaged a little bit based on the fact that maybe it's been overheated, based on the fact that it's leaking everything. It currently has a leaking radiator. All of the radiator hoses are swollen because it is leaking oil so badly that it's ruined all the hoses. In addition to all the hoses being bad, just to give you an idea of how much oil this little 1.4 liter 4-cylinder has leaked, the hood blanket underneath here is completely saturated with oil. It's collecting down here along the edge. Hopefully you guys can see that on my finger there. So the hood blanket's completely saturated. When you open the hood and leave the hood open for an extended period of time, there's oil collecting in the wiper cowl. That is how much oil has leaked out of this thing. And based on all those scenarios that I just told you, where it's pouring coolant, it's pouring oil, and it's basically ruined, the oil has ruined a bunch of different things underneath the hood, I was like, well, let's do a compression and leak down test just to make sure that this thing is actually worth putting money into. And as it turns out, the engine itself is in excellent shape. Everything that's bolted to the engine is ruined. So at the very least, I'm gonna have to rebuild the cooling system. It's gonna get a brand new water pump, new hoses, new radiator, just to physically get the vehicle back on the road. And then I need to wash all the oil out from underneath the hood just to see, okay, where is the oil coming from and how much is it actually leaking? So those are the next videos I have coming up. Hopefully you guys got something out of this content. Like I said, guys, I am a huge fan of the leak down tester versus just doing a compression test. There are other things that you can do though. So what else you can do is you can actually use a smoke machine to do a visual leak down test. And what I mean by that is I've done this in the past. So what I've done prior is I'll do a compression test, find out what cylinder ultimately has the compression issue, and then I will take a smoke machine and shove a smoke machine into the spark plug hole, just like you would on a leak down tester with the valves closed, just to see where the smoke ultimately exits the engine, whether it's the exhaust pipe, the intake manifold, or the crankcase. So that's just another option for you guys that, you know, may not have an air compressor. If you do have a automotive smoke machine, that is an option at your disposal. So guys, I will have links down in the description to the compression tester, to the leak down tester, and finally to the smoke machine like I was just saying. So as always guys, if you like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching guys.